This is a modern-day metronome. It helps you keep time with the music when you're playing an instrument. Now, before we had this modern electronic version, we had an older kind of metronome that you could use for the same purpose. This little box right here has a metal rod with a weight on it that ticks back and forth to help you keep time with the music. Just like that. You can slide the weight up and down this rod to change the tempo of the music. And if you slide all the way down to the bottom here, that's pretty fast. And after a while, if you're not actually using it to play an instrument, it gets kind of annoying. Well, I want to talk to you about a principle today called the Pendulum Principle. This is something I've seen in tons of businesses. Very common situation where you have a business or a leader that is making decisions based on immediacy only. And they tend to overcorrect in significant ways. And that can be a real problem. I use the example of a metronome because it's basically an inverted pendulum, right? A pendulum just swinging back and forth, really under no control of its own, right? Being controlled solely by the forces of gravity. Now, in business, we want to make deliberate decisions, right? We always talk about making proactive decisions and really controlling the impact of external forces on our business and on our teams. What tends to happen is we make a decision and then we overcorrect too quickly for that decision, which causes a tension between two extremes on a continuum for that decision that then we constantly are having to correct and recorrect back and forth, and it can really give our employees whiplash. This tendency of leaders to overcorrect takes many different forms, but one thing they all have in common is how they make the associates feel. If your change is happening too frequently and too drastically, confidence in senior leadership of your company will be eroded. Our reactions to fear, as well as unaddressed business needs, can result in a risk of overcompensating. So we're going to look at 3 principles of balance in business, right? So the first of these principles is that pendulum principle that we've been talking about, right? So when you're swinging an actual pendulum, right, it's going side to side, what's happening is it goes to its apex, to the top of one side or the other, and it's got a lot of potential energy that then naturally is forced back the other direction. But it doesn't stop at center. It keeps on going until it achieves that equilibrium on the other side and continues to bounce back and forth on that string, right? With the tension coming from the push against the fulcrum. And we'll get to that principle here in a minute. But when this happens, we become unintentional participants in the pendulum principle. So realizing when we have swung the pendulum hard in one direction helps us understand the extremes of the business. And it's important that we do identify what are those extremes and recognize that being in the dead center isn't necessarily where we want to be, but what we're trying to avoid is that swinging back and forth motion that can happen across quarters or even years. So let's talk about one example. So talk about accountability. If you swing to one side really hard, this may severely impact retention of your associates and frustrate the efforts for individual development and learning. But if you swing it too hard in the other direction on accountability, it may negatively impact the business results and increase the company's liability in the future. Okay, what about distribution? There's been a lot of challenges with distribution coming out of the pandemic. Well, if it's swung too hard in one direction, this may look like you're selling items in locations where you don't want to have those items sold, right? Where locations that don't hold up your brand promise and they're not going to attract enough customers, right? Those locations might struggle to solely focus on your business products and might have to bring in other things to help make ends meet, which is not what you want for them or yourself. And be in constant danger of not being able to hit their contractual expectations to you. On the other hand, if you have too little distribution, You can lose brand recognition. Associates don't feel the need to try as hard, and we can miss out on business that we could have otherwise. All right, let's talk about another one. The amount of time that a business associate, like if you've got some business associates in your retail location, the amount of time they spend in the store building relationships with store leaders and associates, that's a good thing. But if they spend too much time, that could shift to either extreme, where they know every associate extremely well and receive some referrals from the store location on a regular basis, but they don't have time to sufficiently prospect for themselves. Or, on the other hand, where they have plenty of time to prospect and close their own business, but they have poor relationships with the stores and they never receive any supplemental business from the stores through referrals. So that takes us to our next principle. This is what I like to call the Accordion Principle. So our reactions to fear, right, and our overcompensating can cause us to engage in that pendulum principle unintentionally. But as we take control of when we push behaviors away from one extreme and toward the other deliberately, we're moving to that accordion principle. So this is a little bit better. This is where you more proactively control the movement instead of the movement being controlled by you constantly reacting. So an accordion is controlled by the player. Now, I am not an accordion player, right? But it is extended or compressed based on volume, type of sound, or how long the player wants to sustain a note. Once you have identified the extremes in your business, then you can begin controlling them, right? To do that, you'll need to identify other points between the extremes that you can control proactively. Just as an accordion player wouldn't only want their instrument fully extended at all times, and they wouldn't want it fully compressed at all times, right? The ideal state will be somewhere between most of the time, and it will change as needed based on the music that they choose to play. So your business needs will also change, of course, and you will have to adjust your leadership to match them. When you are doing this proactively and with less external influence and are guiding the direction of your business by making consistent decisions to achieve the balance, then you are coming closer to the next principle, which is placing the fulcrum. Okay, so once you've identified the extremes that occur during the pendulum's principle, during that swing, then you move on to the accordion principle, where you identify the controllable behaviors that we can engage in to influence the business and move away from the extremes. Then you have to decide where the proper balance is located. So in a standard measure, there's a weight on each side, and there's a fulcrum point in the middle to determine which side is heavier and by how much. So this kind of object lesson, right, we might be tempted to immediately think about the center of the scale as the ideal place for the fulcrum to be. But that is definitely not the case, because the loads on each side of that balance could be different, and depending on how big the load is on one side versus another, you'll need to shift the fulcrum closer or further away from one side or the other in order to get it to balance. The key to understanding this principle is not to make a judgment that balanced means equally weighted on each side or being dead center of the two extremes. Your fear that you identified as you have been thinking about this, any fears, those would be things that would require you to place your fulcrum more right or more left of center. But having it dead center when it comes to sales techniques, for example, may not be aggressive enough to achieve your sales goal. And having a dead center approach to customer engagement in your stores may not provide a level of experience that you want your customers to have, right? So it's going to depend. So let's do an example. All right, this is just kind of a fun example, but let's say we were going to do this for guitars. All right, so if we did this for guitars, then what would we want to do first? We'd want to identify the extremes, right? That's what we talked about. So let's go ahead and do that. Here's our continuum. All right, so here's one extreme. Okay, That doesn't look very extreme, right? But that's like some kind of, I don't know, like a Renaissance age guitar or something. I don't play the guitar either. All right, and then on the other side, the other extreme would be like some kind of crazy, I don't know, experimental guitar from like the 1980s or something, okay? All right, so we're going to click into this and find more tick marks, right? So for each tick mark that appears, we've got to identify like some other reference points that start to move more and more towards center away from each of the extremes, okay? So there's one over there on the left that just appeared, so we're going to say, you know, maybe that's like a mandolin or something, I don't know. And then there's another one on the right, so I don't know, maybe that's some kind of like a double-handled guitar, something crazy. Okay, there's another one on the left, so that's, you know, maybe it's like you know, some kind of just classical guitar. Another one on the right, so, you know, that's something like a custom rock guitar. Okay, another one on the left, and then maybe it's like a country music, you know, acoustic guitar, and then over on the right, it's like just a basic Fender electric guitar, and so on, right? So you get all these points until eventually you fill it in, and then you have to decide, okay, what's right for my business? Okay, maybe what's right for your business is, you know, just a little right of center or a little left of center, or maybe it's further out on one side or the other. But once you've identified all the different points, then you just have a much better idea of what that could look like for you. So that's my challenge to you observing this video, right, is to go back, look at your business, look at the ways in which you may be swinging back and forth on that pendulum, and then identify the extremes, work toward the center, and then place the fulcrum to identify what is the ideal place for your business to be balanced based on the factors that you can control. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment to let me know what other business principles you'd like me to cover. I've got a lot more content on the way, and I'd love to hear from you.